Hi everyone and welcome back. So like we always do, let's try to familiarize ourselves with these three new libraries. And in this video, I'll give you a lot of examples in which we can acquaint ourselves with the syntax and also see some examples where we can load, create new files, load and modify existing Excel files, iterate through rows and columns, and do the basic things that we would like to do if we had an Excel. But we'll do that programmatically with these three libraries, and we'll see a lot of example for OpenPyXL. We have already seen some manipulations on Pandas, but we'll see more. And then we will finally see XlsxWriter and how we can create new Excel files through XlsxWriter. So let's start. First, let me quickly check if I have these libraries. I'll do pip install OpenPyXL, and I also want to install XlsxWriter. So XlsxWriter. Okay. So I have these libraries installed. I have Pandas already installed because I know I've been using Pandas. We have used Pandas and saw a lot of use cases. So let's start with the first one, which is OpenPyXL. And this allows us to read and write Excel files as well as modify existing files. In the following few examples, we'll see how we can do so. So I have this particular Jupyter notebook open in this directory. And now let me create some new files. I'll add a piece of code. Let's start. So in order to create a new notebook, first let me just import this library. I'll need to import from OpenPyXL import workbook and load workbook from OpenPyXL dot styles import font alignment pattern fill. Okay, so let's import these things. And now let me initialize a workbook object, workbook, and with workbook, let me go to worksheet. So I'll do workbook.active. Now, the reason I'm doing this is because one workbook can have a lot of worksheets, and when you're opening, let's say, an existing workbook, you may need to define which worksheet do you want to work with, right? So we have seen there can be different sheets for a workbook, but in this case, since we are creating, it's just one single worksheet, and I'm just initializing a worksheet object. And now let's add data to our cells. So in my worksheet, I'll go and open a square bracket, add A1, and then A1 I want to be hello, and then worksheet, open a square bracket, B1 I want it to be world. Okay, and now let's say I want to give some more values. A2 is equals to 42, the answer to everything, and B2, I'll define B2 as approximation of pi. So let's just give this few data cells, and let me just save this workbook. So I'll just do b.save, and I'll save it as example of OpenPyXL dot XlsX. Okay, perfect. So now I have a new workbook which is saved, and it's here in the same directory as my code. So let me just click on it, and okay, so this is an Excel notebook, a Jupyter. So this is an Excel file. Jupyter cannot directly open this. What I'll do is I will download this, and then I'll open it with my Excel. So there we have it. So let me just add this file here. Perfect. Or I can also do something. No, this is good. So hello is A1, B1 is world, and A2 is 42, B2 is 3.14. And this is my example OpenPyXL. Okay, that's a very simple example. What we did was instantiated a workbook object, created a worksheet. In that worksheet, we went to these cells and added this value, and then we saved the workbook. Okay, makes sense? Sounds good. So let's look at some more examples. Let's look at a new example where we can load and modify an existing workbook. So we have just saved example OpenPyXL. So I can open this workbook as workbook is equals to load workbook example OpenPyXL, and WS is equals to wb.active. Now I want to modify some values, and I want to add some values. So the way I can do that, I can follow the same structure. I'll just open a1 and I'll say updated hello. Okay, let me just put it in quotes, updated hello, and then I'll add a new value, and wsc1, I will do that to be, let's say, some new column. And then let's also do something like this. I'm still playing with the same sheet. Let's create a new sheet, wb.create sheet, and I'll give a title of new sheet, with Python. Okay, now let me just save the workbook, save, and I'll save it as a new one, example OpenPyXL modified dot XlsX. Let's run this. Perfect. So now again, let me close this one. This is the initial one, and I should have another file here. This is the one. I'll download this, and let's open this one. So this is my new file, and if you see in this one, there is the updated value for A1, which is updated hello, and then C1 is some new column, and I also have a new sheet with Python. This new sheet created because I created it programmatically, and that's it. So we are able to change values, we are able to add sheets, we are able to add new value, and we can save this again. So what we did was we loaded an existing sheet and the existing workbook, and then did some manipulations and created a new one. Moving on, let's look at another example. If I have to iterate through rows and columns, that's also something I can do with a function called iterate rows. So essentially what I can do is I can simply do for row in ws dot iter rows, and I can define the parameters here. I'll say min row is equals to 1, max row is equals to 2, min column is equals to 1, and max column is equals to 3, let's say. And in that case, I'll say for cell in row print cell dot value. Okay, so remember that ws is nothing but this sheet which is currently active. So we loaded the existing sheet, we loaded the example OpenPyXL workbook, and then we loaded ws, and we did some manipulations on ws and saved it in a new one. So ws is the modified Excel that we currently have, and what I did was I used this column called iter rows, through which I iterated from row 1 to row 2, min column 1 to column 3. And in this case, I got, for each cell in the row, I printed the cell value. So essentially what I did was I started with this one, A1, which is row 1, and I went to maximum row is 2. So I started with this row and I went up to here, and I started with the first column, which is this one, and I went to the third column. So essentially I'm going row wise, and even in row I'm starting to print from the first value, which is cell in row. So the first cell gets printed, second cell gets printed, third cell gets printed because of this second for loop, and then it goes back to the first for loop and prints out on the other row. It iterates over the row and then prints out all the cell values of that row, and that's what we did here. Similarly, you can do the same iteration through column by using a function called iter columns. And again, when we are doing this manipulation, we can put, let's say, some if conditions here, if conditions, or some intermediate calculations, and then accordingly we can modify some cell values and store them in new or existing sheet, right? So essentially what you can do with these kinds of iterative functions is you can go through the sheet. For example, I am doing a sanity check on data. Well, maybe the default functions don't satisfy my need and I want to iterate through all the cells. I can essentially use some sort of function like this, get value of each cell and then do sanity on that value, and then accordingly do my further operations. So this is very helpful in those cases, and in cases of pre-processing it's very helpful, or modification of data it's very helpful. Now let's move on to another example. With the first three examples we looked at very basic data entry and modification. Now we are moving more towards formatting and styling. So let's look at an example of merging and unmerging. Let's say I want to merge A4 to B4. I'll go, so let me just close this workbook here. Sure. And let me just close this. And now I want to say take ws dot merge cells A4 through B4. Okay. And then ws, I'll add some data to it. A4 is equals to merged cell. And let me just do this, and I'll save this. wb dot save example modified. Let's run this. Okay, so I closed the notebook and I've just ran on the same modified notebook. I'll download this one and let me open this up. So there we go. A4 and B4, this is a merge cell, and we have merged A to B in one single cell, and I've written this data into that merged cell. Similarly, you can do an unmerge of cells. If let's say two cells or a bunch of cells are merged, we can unmerge the cells, and I would encourage you to explore that exercise on your own. These kinds of things can also be done using OpenPyXL and using Python, and doing that programmatically. So moving on to the final example, we have applying styling. So let's start with some specific fonts. I'll do ws A1. I'll call the first cell, and on this cell I want to call the attribute font, and I want to give it font name is equals to Arial. So I'll give name is equals to Arial, size is equals to, let me make it very large, let's say 20, and let me also bolden it out. Okay, and then let me do some more formatting on another cell, b2 dot fill. So in this case I'm trying to fill inside the cell, and I'll do a pattern fill start color is equals to, I'll give a string for color. Now the way you can look up these strings or the color codes is you can just see color codes, and I can just compute any color code, right? So this is the color code, and if I give FFFF00, that stands for this one, and this is hexadecimal color code, and you can actually look up the color codes through these kinds of online portals, or you can also actually look up these functions. So I can go and open up the documentation of this library OpenPyXL and go through what are the functions available for styling, and I can use and see what parameters these functions take. So in this case it can take a start color and end color, and I'll give end color as, let's say I give an end color as this one, or let's change this, let's say I give end color as this. Okay, and let me do fill type is equals to solid, and I'll save this as a new workbook, example OpenPyXL styled dot XlsX, and let me just put it in quotes, and that's it. So let's see, I have a styled notebook. Let me just download it. I'll open this up. There you go. So in this one we changed the font of this A1 to a very huge font and boldened it out, and for this one we did a solid fill, but for a solid fill, because this fill is solid, it's just filling it with one color. I think I'm assuming this is filling it with the start color, and if, let me just check this color once again. Yeah, it seems like it is filling with the start color. I can also test this out by giving my start color and end color as same. I'll execute this. I will download the notebook again, or download the Excel again, open this one, and let's see. Yes, So this one is the second color that we had in our list. So this is what we can do. We can also apply different types of styling on different cells. And again, please feel free to open this library, open the documentation of OpenPyXL, and go through the styling functions and explore what are the different types of styling that is available, and try to do things, try to take some Excel sheets and try to format them programmatically. Okay, perfect. Moving on to the second part, which is working with pandas. So let's dive into a couple of examples for Excel sheet. Let me just import pandas as PD, and what I'll do is I'll just initialize a data frame. I'll use a function called read Excel, and I'll directly read one of the existing files, example openpyxl.xlsx, and let me just do df.head add pd dot, there you go. So we have this particular data frame. Now what pandas does by default is, since this file had only two values each in column and rows, so it created the first row and it treated the first rows as headers, and by default it does that. Whenever you are importing Excel, by default the first row is treated as headers, and then you only have one row which had these values, which is true in most cases, but you can give another one parameter and ignore and say there are no headers, then it would consider both of these values as values and not headers. So with a very simple function and in a very clean way, we can read Excel files in pandas. And pandas again is a very general library for data analysis and manipulation. So Excel is just a small part of pandas overall. But can we also do more? We can do a lot of more things. We can do now, once we have this as a data frame, all the analysis that we did so far on pandas, we can do all of it. And then let's say I want to save it again. Then what I can do is, suppose I've done all data frame analysis, and then now I want to save this file. I'll say df.toXL and example pandas.xlsx, done. And now that creates my Excel, so data frame exported back as an Excel. Now I can download this. Let me just open that up. So this is my data frame converted to an Excel sheet. Now by default, again, when I call the toXL function, it also took the indices, and it also had the, in the first column, it entered all the indices of the rows, and then the data starts from here. So that's by default. Again, you can choose to drop the index column by specifying a parameter in the toXL function. Great. Moving on to our final example, final part, which is, let me add a bunch of code blocks here, which is working with XlsxWriter. So now we saw two libraries, and now we'll move on to XlsxWriter. And XlsxWriter is particularly useful for creating new Excel files in a speedy manner. So this is faster compared to OpenPyXL because this is not that general. It's optimized for creating new spreadsheets. So import XlsxWriter. Now I'll define a new workbook by saying workbook is equals to XlsxWriter dot workbook, and I'll say example of XlsxWriter. Okay, perfect. Now in this one, the syntax is a little different than OpenPyXL, so I'll add worksheet. Oh, I see. I'll add worksheet, and I'll define worksheet as workbook. I'll add worksheet as workbook dot add worksheet. I'll call this function, and now when I do that, I've added a worksheet to the workbook. Now I can do the processing. Let's add some data. So I'll call worksheet dot write, and I want to write in the cell A1, and I'll write hello. So let's copy this, and in the cell B1, let's write world. In the cell A2, let's write the answer to everything, which is 42, and B2, let's write the same thing, 3.14. Perfect. So now let's move on and add a chart here. Can I add a chart? But let's see. I've done this. Do I have something here? Not right now, because so I don't have anything here. And the reason I don't have anything here is because I need to close the workbook in order for this to save. So I'll need to explicitly write our workbook.close, and then it'll close. So let's say workbook.close, and it'll close. But I will not execute this because remember, I cannot open or modify existing workbooks. I can only save new ones. So let me just do some more processing here. Let's add a type of chart. Chart is equals to workbook dot add chart, and I'll say type, which is, let's do that, type is line. Okay, now I want to add the above series into the chart dot add series, and I'll say categories is equals to sheet1. Sheet1 is the name by default, $a$1. So again, the formula is exactly similar to how we write a formula in Excel, and I'll just give the range here, absolute reference from A1 to A2. And then in the same way, I'll add values as a formula here. And then finally, I'll give it a name, and the name will be, let's call it data. Okay, perfect. Now I have a chart. I have added series for the chart, and let's insert this chart in my worksheet. So I'll do worksheet.insert chart, and I'll insert it in C1, and I'll call chart. Okay. Finally, let's close a workbook dot close, and that's it. And there we go. And finally, I'll just insert this chart and I'll close the workbook. Perfect. Now I should have this here, and I have this example XlsxWriter. I'll download this file, and let me open this one. Perfect. Let's pull it over here. So there you go. So I considered two sets, series A and series B, and I plotted each of those against one another. Now hello and 42 in this case are on the x-axis, and I have 3.14 here, but then world does not correspond to anything, so it just plotted on 0. That must be how Excel handles these kinds of mixed functions where you have one numerical and one string value, and that's it. So you can add charts through XlsxWriter. So essentially what we did here is we did not close the workbook till our processing was complete, because we can't open it again and modify it. We'll have to create a new one and save it. So in essence, in this video, we looked at three different libraries. OpenPyXL looked at several examples of OpenPyXL. Then we looked at Pandas. We just looked at how to read and write files, Excel files in Pandas. And then in the subsequent ones, you can do a lot of calculation. And finally, we looked at XlsxWriter and how to create new workbooks and add charts using XlsxWriter. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next video.